Hello and welcome to the King's College London Wargaming Network speaker series. My name is David Banks. I'm Wargaming Lecturer and Academic Director of the Wargaming Network at King's College London. And I'm here today to introduce our speaker, Kate Kuehn, who's going to be presenting today on valid and meaningful assessment of wargames. A few words here before we get started on today's presentation. As I said, my name is David Banks, Wargaming Lecturer and Academic Director of the Wargaming Network at King's College. The Wargaming Network is a collection of researchers and educators dedicated to understanding the epistemological and pedagogical foundations of wargaming, as well as wargaming's wider effects in society. And today I'm very happy to introduce our new annual speaker series, where our theme for this year is evaluating and assessing the impact of wargaming on individuals and organizations, trying to get a better understanding of when and how and why people and organizations learn from wargames. So we've been inviting speakers who have made important new contributions to developing thought on these issues. And today we have with us Kate Kuehn, who is Director of Institutional Research, Assessment and Planning at the Marine Corps University. Now, before I give a full introduction for Ms. Kuehn, let me just remind some people about how this is going to work. We're going to have the presentation, which will last 45 minutes to an hour. And what I'll ask people to do is to please put any questions that they have in the Q&A function of the chat rather than the direct chat function. So for people who are interested in asking any questions, please put those questions into the Q&A element of Zoom. I'll be looking at those and then I'll moderate the questions in the Q&A section. We have people currently tuning in to this speaker series from all over the world, including the United States, Canada, Italy, Finland, and hopefully many other places besides. And so I don't want to spend too much time with the introductions and rather get to the content. But before I do that, I do want to introduce our speaker properly. So as I said, Kate Kuehn is the Director of Institutional Research, Assessment and Planning at the Marine Corps University, where she supports the evaluation of all MCU professional military education programs and directorates. Kate has spent 12 years working on evaluation and assessment of military education programs, providing advice on the design of learning assessments at the classroom, program, and institutional level. Her research focuses on assessment and performance evaluation in complex contexts, with a current focus on assessment in team-based simulated learning environments. Kate has an MA from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and a BA from the College of William and Mary. She is a doctoral candidate at George Mason University's College of Education and Human Development, with specializations in education research methodology and educational psychology. Her dissertation proposes an assessment framework for collaborative, ill-structured games and examines its application to educational wargame practice. So as you can hear, she has a wealth of practical experience as well as deep academic knowledge. And so she'll be presenting today on valid and meaningful assessment of wargames. And I'm sure she has a great deal for us to learn. So I turn it over to Kate now. And I remind everyone to please put your questions into the Q&A section. Kate, I think you're still on mute, by the way.
Apologies, I lost my mute button for a moment. All right, well, I'm very happy to be here and to kick off what I think is an excellent subject, obviously, for a speaker series relative to wargaming, and to see some familiar names in the audience as well. So I want to start off by giving a little bit of background. My insights for this presentation are really consolidated from a case study that I conducted in the fall of 2020, looking at a program, an intermediate level education program in the United States that was responding to a direction, guidance to expand wargaming in the curriculum quite rapidly. And so there were some interviews, observations, and some document analysis that I conducted to take a look at faculty perspectives for challenges and meaningful assessment of learning within those wargaming activities that were being expanded. As David said, I also have professional experience at Marine Corps University and then previously at National Defense University, working on designing evaluation and assessment at the course and program level for military education programs, which, as wargaming is a very valuable cultural practice within those educational institutions, has involved a lot of discussion about how authentic activities like war games can be used to foster learning and to assess whether student capabilities that we see in the classroom will transfer into that professional environment when they return to their positions subsequently. And then, of course, my doctoral research has also focused on how do we connect this idea of wargaming to higher education literature more broadly, and some of this theory for assessment and measurement that has struggled to be connected to simulation and gaming practices more broadly in education. As a government employee, I do want to start with a disclaimer that the views presented are my own and do not necessarily represent the views of the Marine Corps, Department of Defense, or any of its components. All right, so why are we here? Why are we talking about assessment of war games? As many of you in the audience already know, as members of this society, war games are an incredibly valuable tool for authentic and complex learning. They're one of the few activities we have that actually allow us to recreate complex systems and to embed or give the sense of embeddedness for students within those systems where they can see how their actions create and consequences in that environment and then try to react to those consequences as well. Authentic learning such as that is also really important, as I've mentioned, for potential evidence of learning transfer. If they're able to function well, able to perform well in an environment that is similar to their future environment, it gives us greater confidence that they're able to then perform those same functions at that same level in those future situations. Wargames are also really valuable as an analytical tool. You can critically examine the quality of your thinking, your understanding of how a system works, the relationships between key variables, assumptions that you make about your adversaries or about your own resources and teammates. And as we've seen increasing demand, particularly in the United States PME, we see that that demand is a reflection of the value that's perceived, but we have challenges in terms of how we actually document and demonstrate the value of those activities, because much of it is experienced as opposed to documented in a connected way to our measurement approaches. And that's something that is true as a challenge in simulation-based learning and games-based learning as well. So I want to talk a little bit about assessment because we use the term assessment to mean many different things in practical parlance. We talk about it as a tool. Sometimes we'll call an assessment the same thing as a survey. The survey is an assessment. We talk about assessment in terms of judgment. So we use that word in many different ways. When I talk about assessment, I'm discussing assessment overall as an argument. This idea that we're trying to make a claim about something or someone in order to support a specific decision. And if you can draw from the measurement literature, there's fantastic research in terms of Toulmin from 1958 that talks about argumentation and how we can structure measurement as an argument that's supported by evidence. And you start by developing that argument by thinking about your theoretical reasoning or prior data that would connect your evidence to making a particular claim. That's called what he refers to as a warrant. You look at the actual data that you collect during that activity that's going to substantiate that claim, whether it's someone's success or failure or a certain level of performance. And you also look at potential counter arguments, things that are going to potentially constrain or dial back your confidence in a particular claim. So an example, we might make a claim from a learning activity that an individual who performs well in a particular game, particularly an authentic game, will perform well in similar contexts in the future. We would make that logical argument based on some theory about authentic learning and the connection between learning environments, as well as connection to theory in terms of how we're measuring their performance, and that captures key aspects of the performance that we're actually examining in question. We would support that with data that connects to that reasoning that we observe in that activity. But we would also need to consider other things that would make us less confident that that claim was true. And that's particularly important to consider within a game-based environment, within a wargame environment, because there are many potential counter-arguments we need to consider. Things like game design, the impact of the rules of the game on the individual's ability to demonstrate their full performance level, impact of other players, or impact of teammates on the decisions that are made by that individual can sometimes make us wonder whether that would be reproduced or is it reproducible in a future context. And that's something that we'll talk about more today. So this is a simplified version of what many people will see as they start reading about assessment as a process. How do we take an argument and operationalize that in a particular activity? And there are some great resources out there, including ones on evidence-centered design that Ms. Levy and others have written that specifically look at incorporating assessment into games-based activities. But what I've tried to do here is draw out some of these key points for the steps that you would need to take and ultimately the counter arguments you'd need to consider and mitigate as you go through baking in assessment into a wargame activity. Ultimately, that's going to include answering the question, what is it we're actually trying to measure? What are we trying to assess? What claim are we trying to make? Is it about a learning outcome? Is it about a particular thing? As if in analytical approaches, we look at doctrine as opposed to individuals, or we might look at the successful use of a particular new type of weaponry. Your second step is going to be specifying your task model, really looking at your task activity and game and determining what elements of it are important, telling the story of your game itself. And you're going to go through the step of mapping that actual task model to potential measurement opportunities and tools that support the claim that you're trying to make, support or shape your confidence in the claim you're trying to make. So taking account of counter arguments as well. And then ultimately, also considering the standards for quality and validity of the different measurement tools that you've decided to use, but also standards of quality for the overall argument that you've assembled with all of the different data that you're considering. So as we start in step one, we think about different aspects of a claim that we need to specify. And because games create a multi-level system, that means that we need to consider at what level, what is the subject or who is the subject of the assessment question that we're asking. When I'm talking about a multi-level system, what I mean is we have an individual learner who is embedded in a group, who are using objects that are created in that game, who are then also in a larger system, whether it's a course or a program of study or an organization. And each of those things has influences on how well or how the actual subsystem functions. So an individual can be affected by members of their group. They can be affected by group processes and distribution of labor. The objects or the different tools that are available, the scenarios perhaps that are available to a group will shape how they respond and actually make decisions within a game. And then the broader aspects of game design, the tools, rules, and roles that are assigned should also be considered here. And in combination, games can tell us things about the success of a program or the success of an organization, the impact or effectiveness of those things. And so our questions will change depending on what level we're really interested in looking at. And the framework that we're going to use, the combination of evidence that we draw together to try and support that claim in our argument, will also change depending on what level we're functioning at. Now, games can support assessment at any of those levels, and the data that we can collect can be combined and recombined in different ways to frame and support different questions. But we will come at it with a very clear idea of what that research question is, what that assessment question is, in order to come up with a framework for each of those approaches and take different considerations in mind for quality and validity of that standard, the standards that we apply. As we think about claims, another really important aspect to consider is one level down from that. What is the actual assessment claim about? Are we talking about learners at the individual or group level? Are we trying to look at giving some sort of formative claim, how learners can improve, how a group of learners can improve? Are we looking at mastery, trying to make a statement about the relative skill that an individual or a group perhaps has relative to a scale that's common across a certain level of expertise? Are we looking to talk about achievement, which would ultimately be individual performance relative to others or group performance relative to others? Making an argument or a claim about transfer. How well will an individual or a group perform in the future? That sort of predictive type of claim. And then claims that are more about the game or the program itself, right? How effective was this game at fostering individual or group learning? Or what impact did this game have on individual or group learning? We also need to consider the specific construct. It's not enough to know that we're looking at individual learning in terms of mastery or achievement or transfer. We need to think about what's the specific construct that we have in mind. That can be a learning outcome, or it could be some other aspect of performance that we're looking at. Think here of things like critical thinking or creativity, which is a particular interest of mine. If you're looking for creativity and creative ability within a war game, you will look in different places and you will look at different behaviors that are associated with creativity. So defining exactly what it is you're looking for in terms of a construct is important. That will help shape where, how, and when you're going to use assessment tools and how they will combine together. And the final thing to consider about your claim is its intended use. And this is something that one of the foundational thinkers of measurement really emphasizes, and that's Messick. The use of the information is really important. That shapes the validity and the standards that you're going to put in place. It also shapes and helps you think more thoroughly about the claim that you're intending to make and whether you're asking the right question, because assessment is not a means in and of itself. It's meant to inform a particular decision or action. It's meant to inform learning. If you have a learning focus, it could inform talent management. And if, depending on the stakes, whether it's a high stakes or low stakes decision, you want to take in mind, to keep that in mind as you determine what types of evidence and what are your standards for those evidence as you go forward. And that is a particular thing that I think often in assessment gets put to the, by the wayside. As we think about assessment as something more about accountability in terms of things like accreditation in some of our programs, that assessment is a requirement as opposed to something that facilitates our decision making, whether it's an individual's decision about how they can improve their future performance, what they need to change about their own learning habits, a teacher's decisions about how they could adapt their teaching plan in order to better support student learning, or a program decision looking at how can we refine and have greater impact on our students by changing either how we're preparing faculty members, the types of tools that we're using, or resources that we're making available. If we think about the second step, we're really talking about understanding our task model. And one of the things I love about games and working with wargaming designers and facilitators is the story-based nature of wargaming. As you talk to someone about a wargame activity, they can lead you through a wonderful narrative, the story of the different key moments, players, events, and episodes that are going to occur during a game. And even in unstructured games where there may be multiple pathways that a learner or a team can take in order to achieve their end goals, which is ideal if we're looking for creativity and complex learning. You're going to have some key moments that are built in, some structure to that story. As I was conducting my case study, that's something that came out as I was going through that process and discussions with faculty members and looking at curriculum content. There were some key phases in terms of preparation, a period of time for observing and orienting. There was that key moment of decision, an action reaction phase, and then an adjudication that ultimately either led to briefing the results and an iteration where there was another turn for those students to again, reorient and make new decisions or continue on with their current course of action that had been planned ahead of time, or that was the final turn of the game, and then they would move into more of a debrief or post-game phase where there were certain game results and some sort of evaluation of student participation. Now, this is a somewhat complex model, but it's an example of the type of thing that you can look for when creating a task model, mapping out those key moments and stories, potential observable moments across the course of your activity. As we move on from that and think about how does that connect with the data and the assessment element, a really useful frame or lens that we can use comes from a great book that Springer has published on assessment and games-based learning by Iffenthaler, Esriel, and Gay. And they propose that there are 3 different categories or types of data that you can gather in games. And what's valuable about using this frame is that you can then think about what types of tools you would be using, whether they may be disruptive to the actual game experience itself, and then when the analysis or data collection would have to occur. So the first category or first bucket that they've provided is called an embedded data type. These are those in-game measures about learning activity and behavior. In a digital game, that might be log files that you're able to track. In an in-person game, it might be specific in-game deliverables, like whatever the students are writing down in order to cue an action to be taken, notes that they're passing, those activities or interactions, things that you would be able to capture. There are external data types, things that you can collect that are not part of the gameplay. You might have pre or post assignments relative to the game. You might have a debriefing that's not part of the game, but that looks back on the learning that occurred during a particular game. These are things that are additional and also require additional resources from faculty in order to conduct. They're not naturally occurring over the course of a game. And then finally, there's the game scoring aspect. This idea of to what degree did students achieve overcome the obstacles that were presented to them? Did they achieve certain outcomes that they desired to? In some cases, they have specific targets that they're trying to achieve or objectives. In some cases, we use that language. We can also use some of those scoring details in terms of wins and losses. And there are many different examples that would fit under each of these different categories, depending on the game itself. And what we want to do is bring together the idea of the story of the game and the types of data that we might want to collect. So this is a simplified version of what a game might look like, right? With one turn and very little breakdown in terms of types of interactions, potential steps that might occur. If we were talking about the Marine Corps, they might even break out different parts of the Marine Corps planning process that we would be able to look at. But there are some key elements in terms of preparation that's always going to occur before a game, whether that's teaching game rules, talking about the scenario, giving people time to prepare for their particular role. In some cases, it may also be the curriculum that you've presented them beforehand, a reading and seminar that prepared them for engaging in a war game that's taking place in a particular region that's contemporary or historical. And you can have some sort of an assessment that's aligned to that by looking at, say, the knowledge level of each of those participants. Were they all equally prepared to take part in this game and contribute? You can have aspects that look at interactions. You can have those built-in embedded assignment components that you would be able to go back and look at later, like a decision memo or any other type of written instruction that's considered a component of that activity that's part of that exercise. You can also, again, usually it's at the end of the simplified version, have certain elements of game scoring that pull into that. But just because you can assess in different ways each aspect of these activities doesn't mean that you have to. What you want to do is ensure that you have a variety of measures that are related to the construct and the claim that you need to make. And so that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later as a challenge, because there is such a wealth of data that's available within a game naturally. And there are so many opportunities to add on external assessment. We want to make sure that that's purposeful in a way that supports a claim and does not disrupt the actual learning activity or the faculty's ability to facilitate that game in a meaningful way. So let's talk for a moment about some of the standards that we need to keep in mind. And one of my favorite ways to share and just bring up the idea of validity and reliability is to talk about it in terms of a target. As we think about validity, that's something that tells us that we've measured what we intended to measure. So if you think about it based on these images here, the center mass of each of these targets tells us something about validity. On the leftmost side, you have something that has very high validity because the center mass is the same. Same thing actually on the far right. What we suffer from in terms of the far right is a lack of reliability. The idea that we can have a repeatable performance the way that we want to. So again, without getting too into the weeds in terms of the challenges that exist relative to measurement within game-based contexts, I want to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that I've drawn about validity of the argument overall in games. We can think about validity and reliability in terms of particular measures, which is important to our confidence that that data has meaning for our decision-making. But we should also consider overall the combination of data, and the data that we consider also has the need for standards to be set in terms of what a logical argument, what a good argument that we can have confidence in considers. And that's something that as educators, we actually naturally have an affinity for, because as we teach our students to create and support arguments, whether it's written or oral, we teach them some of these concepts. And the same thing can be applied to the assessment realm and the assessment of games. So we need to think about the clarity of the claim and the evaluation criteria that we're using as critical. We need to think that no single measure is a proxy for proficiency. No single point in time is going to tell us exactly how a student is going to perform in the future. And that's particularly true in games because of their iterative nature. There may be multiple moments and multiple contexts or multiple conditions, I should say, where a student has to make a decision or a student has to exhibit a behavior. And because there is learning occurring across that time and other influences are playing, we need to think about a more complex way of looking at that data. And ultimately that means looking for patterns across multiple points of time and looking at a combination of different measures. It also means consideration of multiple perspectives because there is a multi-level system. What a faculty member is able to observe in terms of how group dynamics have impacted individual performance, for example, it's different from what that individual has experienced, and the faculty member may not be able to observe, just based on practicality, will not be able to observe every moment interaction or how that interaction was received by the group or by the individual. And importantly, you have to consider what are the counter arguments that are here that could actually make you set aside your claim and say that we cannot support this claim based on what we observed. So for example, if we were trying to make a claim about individual learning, but when we actually saw that the game itself had prevented the student from being able to demonstrate creativity, for example. So let's think about an individual creativity in a game. We're looking for them to make some sort of unique decision that's relevant to that context. If the game overly constrains the number of options available to that student and none of them reflect the standards that we're looking for, it's not a fair evaluation of that student's creativity. It's more an evaluation of their ability to choose between available options. In that case, the game and its rules provide that sort of counter argument to say we can't make a claim about student creativity in this context. Similarly, if we're talking about student creativity in a group context, if the group overly constrains the individual's choices and ability to demonstrate their what they would have done, what their decisions would be, we can also have a strong counter argument that suggests that the individual's capability might be different in other group contexts or in less constrained contexts. And so those are things that we need to keep in mind as we look at the argument itself. Have we considered the key counter arguments that people would come and look at our claim and ask about, right? Did you consider the student perspective? Did you consider the impact of the collaboration or of the game rules themselves? Within the case study that I conducted, but also in the literature that I've been reviewing over the course of my work in wargaming, there are some key counter arguments or challenges to assessment that have come out in those discussions with faculty members, with students who are receiving, who are the recipients of these assessments, that I think are useful to consider and bake in to how we approach assessment in wargames, educational wargames in particular. And so I've checked off here kind of those things that came out specifically of the case study that I conducted, because some of those may be contextual, but I think have broader relevance based on some of my reading within the literature, but that's also there for you to judge in terms of whether those may be applicable to your context. I've also checked off where they've been discussed more specifically in the literature on wargaming or game-based learning, because those are places where we've seen trends across different application of games or simulation within education. And first and foremost, as we're thinking about a claim, we want to ensure that we have clarity of that claim, as we've mentioned, but also that that claim is observable within the task that we've actually designed. And a lot of the literature out there brings up the role that design can have on what a student or a group is able to demonstrate. And I've given a couple examples of that previously, but I think it's really important to foot stomp that here in this discussion as mindfulness that design is one of the key bases for confidence in claims that we make about wargaming. Think about authenticity, for example, looking at the authenticity and the connection of a design to a real world scenario, to a real world setting, is a key basis for making a claim that a student's learning or capability will transfer to that similar environment. Within the case study, faculty also raised the point that within unstructured wargames in particular, there was a lack of control within that setting. And many of them were accustomed to that, sometimes in seminar discussions, for example, where they needed to keep in mind that there were certain outcomes that they were looking for within certain settings or to evaluate. But sometimes things took on a mind of their own. This was particularly true if it was dealing with a live adversary, where a certain team is playing against another team and their actions drive the sequence of events and the outcomes of the game itself, because those injects are not determined by the game. Again, your claim is going to be different in an unstructured environment but there are also some mitigations that you can put in place in order to ensure that your outcomes or your claim, the constructs that you're looking for, are visible, regardless of the path that the students take to achieve their outcomes. They also noticed within both the literature and the case study that there was a tendency amongst learners to try and game the system. In some cases, they would recognize certain game rules that they could bend in order to break the system and succeed. In that case, they would show excellent gamesmanship in terms of critical thinking and ability to see through the rules of that game, but they wouldn't necessarily demonstrate the outcome that you were looking for. And this can go sort of into extremes where students make decisions that are not strategic or tactically sound, but that line up with certain level of success or achievement of an outcome. And that's also a place where winning a game can be detrimental, I think, to a student's motivation for learning, or the focus on winning as opposed to success and the soundness of the decisions that are made during that game. As we think about the task in particular, one of the things that's come out dramatically in the literature about assessment and task design in particular is the impact that peers, either in multiplayer systems or in collaborative systems, can have on an individual's ability to perform. It's important to note that the facilitator and the adjudicators can also have an impact on that as well. Because that's the feedback from the system that the individual is in that shapes their next decision. And depending on the actual nature of the feedback that they receive from their peers and from their facilitator and from the game itself, which we talked about previously under design, a student may be steered along a particular path as opposed to the path that they would have done without that external interaction. And that's called sort of outcome interdependency. In the other realm of task, we have challenges of faculty often having to play multiple roles. And this is sometimes a resourcing issue where a faculty has to both facilitate a game and evaluate it at the same time, which can split focus or sometimes make it difficult for a faculty member to dedicate the time necessary to conduct certain parts of the assessment or to view those key elements. We'll talk a little bit about how to approach that, but it's true that a faculty cannot be everywhere at all times, however powerful and insightful they are. There's also a vast array of observation opportunities within a game. We've talked about 3 different categories, but within those categories of data, there are many different places where you could gather data in many different ways. And so in some cases, you just have too much to choose from, which again has that struggle with the multiple faculty roles and the expectation that you have for faculty to be doing both of these things, facilitating learning, assessing achievement of learning, and actually facilitating a game. Because ultimately, as I was speaking with the faculty that participated in my case study, you want to make sure that the game actually functions well, because if there is no game, then there is nothing else to follow from it in terms of meaningful assessment. As we think about mapping, some of the themes that have come out relate to things like fairness of evaluation. When and how is it fair to actually incorporate evaluation of students? This particularly came out in some discussions with faculty about time that it takes the students to learn certain game rules and adjust to the game scenarios. And you don't want to, from a measurement literature perspective, be measuring student capability to learn the rules or their familiarity with the game rules as opposed to their ability to plan, for example, if you are looking at planning as the performance area that you're looking for. You don't want to be distracted by their ability to play game rules and misled to think that those people who actually really understood the game well were the ones that had the greatest capability. There also is a challenge from a measurement perspective in terms of the relevance of sort of out-of-the-box tools that are available. The behaviors that you see in each game might be different are expected to be different depending on the scenario, depending on the context and design of the game. So sometimes it's difficult to just pick up an existing tool and use it and get a meaningful answer from it. As we think about validity and reliability of both the measures and the argument itself that we're making with our claim, it's also challenging to evaluate individuals within teams. And there are some other measurement challenges for groups and games in particular, things like multidimensionality, interdependence, the role of contextualized behaviors, and the multiple perspectives that you need to take into account. And then in the discussion with faculty members as well, when we were talking about formative learning and the ability to take that experience as a student and carry it forward into meaningful subsequent performance and learning. There were some challenges they faced with receptiveness to feedback. And at the end of a multi-day activity, in some cases, students had a challenge listening to or accepting. There was some feedback overload because of the amount of feedback within a game system. Because within that system, they're receiving feedback from their peers, the game, and the faculty throughout that event itself. And ultimately, that can lead to kind of an overload at the end of that process where they're not able to really fully add any more information into that process. And in other cases, actually going through all the way to the end of winning can sometimes create a tension between the lessons that could be learned and the actual game outcomes themselves. The confusion between winning, making them being associated with having made the right decision, as opposed to viewing back, scrolling back and thinking about that decision and whether that was a sound decision based on the evidence that was available to them. So with my final few minutes, I'm going to talk about some ways we can mitigate those challenges. So build it into our process without, in order to have more confidence in a claim that we're trying to make about whether it's individual learning, group learning, or the game itself. And as we think about claims, I think I've almost ad nauseum here mentioned the importance of specifying your claim and having a common understanding across all those participating in the activity and all those assessing it in particular as to what that claim means. Game design is incredibly important to determining whether a claim can be observable. And there are many different aspects of game design that we can see in wargaming and games-based, simulation-based learning literatures about different outcomes and which are observable based on some of those settings. So for example, player freedom and agency, the number of choices and the paths that a student or a player can take in order to succeed or achieve their outcome can be a key difference between what might be a more creative outcome in terms of learning you'd be able to observe and a more analytical outcome that you might be seeking to evaluate. Interdependence is also something that's very important when we're looking for more creative or critical outcomes. And what that really means is that the student or there's task interdependence, goal interdependence, and reward interdependence. If we start with reward interdependence, that means that the success of the individual student is also the success of the group. So there's not going to be a separate or distinct reward for not collaborating. When we talk about task interdependence, we're talking about a task that is complex, sufficiently complex to require people to work together in order to achieve it. And this is obviously particularly important for teams or collaborative learning. And when we're talking about goal interdependence, we're talking about complementary and clear goals so that an individual achieving their own goals is reinforced by the goals of the team themselves. Some of that can be determined within the game design itself, and some of that is going to be based on the team and how they actually establish their own social norms and organization and structure as they proceed through the task. Task complexity and challenge obviously plays a role in what outcomes are observable. Just as if we were writing, creating a writing assignment, we would see different outcomes if we ask someone to summarize versus if we ask them to evaluate. If we ask someone to summarize a book in a book report, we're not going to go and evaluate that summary for creativity because it wasn't part of the design and wasn't equally elicited for each of the students participating in that event. The type of system and the structure of the game is also important as well. And by type of system, I'm specifically talking about the information that's incorporated into that system. So can a student go outside of that system in order to find, or do they need to go outside of that system in order to find information and to support their decision making or their actions? Or is it all structured to the point where there's only a fixed amount of information available in the system that they can use in order to make that decision? Adjudication style, as well as goals and motivation, also play a role. And we can talk about that more in the question and answer session. So I have a further breakdown in the backup if folks are interested in that. I think another final point here is that there's an opportunity to shape the embedded documentation opportunities in order to observe the outcomes that are actually of interest in your game. What I mean by that is there are key moments that are built into many of our wargaming processes where students create idea maps. They'll map out where their red lines are. They'll map out their communication plan. They'll map out different COAs, courses of action. And they'll go through those processes, map them out, but we won't have captured those as we formally captured the specific decision that was ultimately made. If we go back to thinking about creativity, we want to look at both divergent thinking and convergent thinking, and divergent thinking meaning the range of options that were considered and created, produced by that team. And then ultimately the convergent thinking is where they evaluated each of those options in order to identify what was the decision they decided to make. Seeing both sides of that spectrum is important, but often at the decision point, we only see the final decision and not all of the options and thinking that went into that process. So that's true for creativity if we use that as an example here, but it's true related to other outcomes as well. As we think about challenges related to the task, some of the things that we had talked about related to peer impact, facilitator impact, and the resources that faculty have to use, whether it's their time and energy and the roles that they're playing, or the tools that are readily available for them to use. In this case, faculty training can be really important, helping them figure out how to elicit the outcomes that they're looking for and to overcome some of the gamesmanship that they might be seeing in the gameplay, because the faculty play a really strong role. The facilitators play a really strong role in setting goals and in drawing out thinking or behaviors that might be suppressed by other factors in the system, whether it's your peers or the game rules themselves. Actually selecting particular observation points can be really valuable. There are key moments as you tell that story where you might be able to see divergent thinking as an example, right? Where you would expect students to have produced a lot of different ideas and to list them out and then debate convergent thinking, the relative quality and what are the metrics they would use to assess, evaluate each of those options that they had thought of. Targeting those key moments, those key interactions is a valuable way to make good use of faculty observation time. Or if you're unable to actually observe some of those key moments and you want to see the end products, employing some sort of an external measure where you're able to look at the quality or impact of peer interaction or how a group has organized in order to achieve success can be valuable. That's also true from a formative perspective where you can look at how maybe the arrangement or structure of a team might have impacted that outcome. And you could use that as a way to foster discussion during an after action report. You could also prime the situation, right? You can set certain game rules that help shape peer influence or help structure the interaction between teams. There's a trade-off there, but an example that I can give you from a seminar would be that as we look at disagreement across teams, would be that in some of the teams-based research, they'll suggest that if you actually instruct players or members of a seminar that their responsibility is to represent their role's perspective to the fullest extent possible, and that there's an expectation that there will be some, disagreement, however professional, that will lower the negative impact of dissent on group cohesion and success, because that sets a social expectation that there will be disagreement, which is something that teams actually tend to go more towards that groupthink, because there's a disincentive for that type of disagreement. There's some really interesting writing on that in Keith Sawyer's work called Group Genius, amongst other things that he's written. So I think we already kind of hit on this here. There are some embedded opportunities that you can also shape more effectively in order to look at particular outcomes. And in this case, you might be able to trade a little bit of authenticity in order to capture a little bit more about thinking or learning. And what I mean by that is if there are moments where students are submitting or writing or documenting decisions or key actions to move the game forward, there can be small things that you add to those that will help you capture important information, like alternative courses of action, key counter arguments, things that would help you go back and have a really solid debrief discussion, or things that would help you look at, if we're continuing on with the creativity example, look at the convergent and divergent thinking without being too disruptive to the game itself. So we think about mapping. Some of the challenges here we raised were fairness of evaluation and the relevance of existing tools. One of the ways that we can overcome some of the fairness issues is by employing multiple measures and considering multiple perspectives. You want to have particular areas that you look at that will measure at a point when you're confident that the game rules are no longer obscuring a student performance. One of the faculty members that I spoke with talked about in the first few games, the learning experience was primarily formative because he wanted to ensure that students became comfortable with the rules of the game. And then ultimately he became more summative in terms of the evaluation that he was giving for the students, where it was counting for score in terms of their capabilities because they had a solid enough knowledge base in terms of content, but also a solid enough knowledge base in terms of how to function within the game, that he was confident he was seeing their skills and abilities, as opposed to those who were more comfortable with the game to begin with. Clarity of evaluation and scoring criteria is also really important here. And taking that time to adapt existing measures or rubrics to match professional standards or contexts. And there are some great resources out there on how to create some of these more context relevant tools, map down these more general tools to a context in order to make them relevant and meaningful, as opposed to more generic. As long as they're tied to a common theory, you can then bring it back up a level and look at performance across time. And what I mean by that is you may have a criteria related to critical thinking, and you can measure critical thinking across multiple types of assignments and activities, but critical thinking may look different because they take different actions. There'd be different evidence of it in a game with one context and a game with another context and a different challenge that was available to them. But it still is evidence of critical thinking. And so you could look at it more from that holistic perspective of critical thinking across different contexts and activities. And the mapping that I suggested earlier is another tool to mitigate this idea of identifying how much is enough, where, when, and how do you want to actually conduct assessment, and then to holistically look at what is the story, what is the argument that this evidence can support, and is it sufficient? And just because you can measure it, again, doesn't mean that you need to. It may be in some cases that you want to dial back the amount of assessment that you're taking into account, because there are key aspects that you want to consider that capture the key perspectives and activities and learning that you want to use to support your claim or to test your claim, right? Because we don't just want to find supporting evidence, we want to consider those counter arguments. And finally, as we think about quality or validity, either of the tool or of the assessment argument itself, there are some key challenges, particularly if we're talking about assessing individuals within a team or within a multiplayer environment, and then within a game itself. There are certain designs or approaches that you can use to help mitigate some of those challenges for individual assessment. To some extent, that can be by having individual deliverables. And what I mean by that is a student produces their own written product relative to this event. That gives you the ability to look at and isolate that student's insight into that particular event. That can also include sort of pre-post type measures or assignments where you can look at the individual's level of preparation, the individual's takeaways, or what the individual accomplished during that particular activity. You can also take a jigsaw approach, and what that means is, and there's some great work on that that PISA has done when they created their collaborative problem-solving measure. A jigsaw approach looks at assigning particular roles to individuals within a game with specific deliverables that are associated with each of those things. And so it's called a jigsaw because each of the players has a specific role that they play and a different piece of a puzzle that they bring to bear that can be evaluated separately. The challenge there is that each student does need to have a role that is somewhat equal, right? In the sense that they are equally able to demonstrate the learning outcome that you're looking for based on that role. And sometimes that's challenging to do in an authentic wargaming context. You can also look at individual performances across multiple contexts or multiple times. And that in some way eliminates or reduces the noise of context and group, because if you see repeated high-level performance across context and time, it starts to reduce that noise and give you confidence that that is truly the individual's performance capability and not the result of other factors within that particular game. You have more of an opportunity to do that within a course or program as opposed to a game, single game type of application. Just as a final reminder too, if you're looking for change or impact, that also means that you're going to need to use a specific approach. Change requires multiple time points because you want to know where someone was before and after. If you're examining impact, then you might also benefit from using comparison groups, right, to see relative change. Otherwise, you're able to say where one group is, but not whether they would have gotten further or not quite as far if they had taken a different road in terms of learning. In terms of receptiveness to feedback, one of the strategies that was really compelling that faculty shared related to the role of students in the debrief activity. And again, how do we overcome that overload in terms of feedback, ensuring that it's relevant, tying it to future performance and involvement were some key strategies, allowing students to play a strong role in that debrief and identification of key events that they wanted to talk about and break down, and letting them know that in the beginning that that was their role was a way to keep it consistent with the interactive process that they had just been through. Authentic design, I think I said this previously, can also boost your confidence in claims of transfer. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. I'm happy to continue this conversation. I've shared my email here, but I know we're open to questions and answers also.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much for a really comprehensive presentation. And before I get to Q&A, I just want to say it was just so interesting from my perspective in seeing the ability to actually kind of disaggregate all these tiny bits of the learning dilemmas that exist inside gaming. So, I mean, the framework is extremely useful for being able to pick out the different parts of what you're trying to assess at different stages. So I have questions. I'm sure possibly there's going to be more that are trickling in, but I want to make sure that the ones that went into the list go first. So some of these are going to be very specific to what you're presenting on, and some are a little bit more general. So there's currently 8. So I'll just make you conscious of that so that you know how much time you have roughly. I'll just give them maybe 1 or 2 at a time so that you can sort of think about them. One here is very straightforward, which is, could we get a list of documents and references which have been highlighted in the presentation, please? If you can share that with us, we can make sure that it goes out with the YouTube video or something in the comments section. So we'll make sure that those references are out. So that's a very straightforward one. It's not really specific to your subject matter, but it might be something you have insights in regarding to your professional position. Aaron is asking why, he wonders why there isn't a MOS and career field for CW, I'm not quite sure what that means, and NCOs across the services for wargame analyst, leader, modeler, etc. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts. I know that the MCU does have the Krulak Center and stuff like this, and I just wonder what your thoughts as to why this isn't so integrated, or maybe it is.
Yeah, that's a great question, and has been something that we've been talking about relative to Talent Management 2030 in the Marine Corps in particular, as we try to identify what are some key skills that we want to be able to both develop and track and use across the total force. So I would say, I think the creation, this is my personal perspective, the creation of an MOS in particular has some more hoops that you need to jump through in order to accomplish that. That doesn't mean that it's not something that could be put into the works. One of the things that we've considered is whether there needs to be some sort of micro-credentialing related to it. I think, like many organizations, we're trying to consider what the best way is to structure wargaming without overly structuring it to prevent creativity and innovation, so that it doesn't become one note. So those are my personal perspectives on it.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's just useful just so that people get a sense of this. I mean, we all know that wargaming is kind of expanding more and more into different areas as a profession, but it is interesting to see how some organizations sort of struggle to be able to incorporate it. There's a question here from Mike Dunn. And so he references a piece from War on the Rocks that you may have read by Jim Lacey, where he contrasts when he gave what he considered his best lecture ever, and the students didn't really internalize it, versus a time when he had them playing a game as well as doing relevant readings around Thucydides. I'm phrasing this slightly poorly, but I'm just trying to set it up slightly because the article is not referenced. But the question here is, so in kind of comparing a best lecture ever versus using gaming, how would you structure a study to confirm or deny those observations? Like, how could you demonstrate, do you think, that gaming is working better than an alternative pedagogical method?
That's a great question. And I tried to hint at it a little bit in the mitigating challenges slide here on quality. So if you're trying to compare whether one approach is better than another, what's really important is that you have both a pre-post and a comparison group. So what I mean by that is you would have one group of students who have a lecture and then some sort of assessment as associated after it, whether it's a written product or less likely in a graduate setting, some sort of multiple choice test in terms of recollection. And you have one set of students who have the same preparation, whether it's reading, etc., who then engage in a game and the same assessment after the fact. And then you could have a reasonable basis for making a comparison in terms of growth. And one of the things I would also consider there would be relative to retention, because there is some evidence that using information, using and applying lessons will last with you longer. So I would consider not just having a post-assessment, but having something also later to see whether, say if you did it at the beginning of a semester, perhaps at the end of that semester, also having an assessment incorporated somewhere else where you could see whether there was retention of those lessons or continuing, they're able to still answer questions about the relevance of the lessons of that historical event to the event that they're dealing with now, for example.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question here from Marco. Now, I'm going to try to paraphrase it as well because it's slightly longer, so I may be doing it an injustice. But the question here is, how can we categorize one of the most available evaluation tools in commercial war games, which is strategic depth, that is used to summarize and sort difficulties, complexities, and fun for expert measures? So if I'm going to rephrase this slightly, I think the question might be is, how do we kind of include complexity into games, or how do you manage that kind of component of learning? And as a similar question he has to go into this is, where can we put the most common measurement parameter regarding the standard length of a game? So how long is a good learning game? I mean, the standard in kind of classrooms and in professional settings seems to be an afternoon, right? He has 2 to 4 hours here. But what do you think about the fact that that's the way that games tend to be run?
And I'm not as familiar with the tool that was referenced in the first part of the question, but
so
if I
he referred to the term strategic depth. So I think what might perhaps be at the heart of this question, which is a very common one I'm aware of in teaching around wargaming, is people thinking that complexity of games kind of gives you a depth, right? That's very common in commercial wargaming. So kind of how would you address that in terms of the degree to which depth, complexity, for example, gets to the concept of, for example, authenticity that you talked about earlier?
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges also is that even though there is that complexity, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is the same as reality, right? And so there's some literature out there, right, that talks about how wargaming isn't truth, right? That it isn't a space for learning, but that you can't assume that your what works one day will work the next day, because there will be a different combination of variables. And within the game itself, because of the rules to make the game function, there are assumptions that could be wrong, right? That are built in by the game designer and by our understanding of the world. So in some ways, when our game reflects reality, it's a sign that perhaps our assumptions in those games are correct. But I'm getting a little bit off topic here. How do we consider strategic depth in games as part of our assessment? I would consider it as part of how we talk about authenticity and when it's important, and authenticity that's tied to the demonstration of our outcome, right? Because there's a lot of things that we could make based in reality, but in some cases that might be an overinvestment of resources and time that wouldn't necessarily support the outcome. And what I mean by that is you can spend a lot of time focused on, for example, logistics in a game, right? Which can be very complex. But if the outcome isn't related to their ability or in some way connected to their ability to conduct logistics, you might be able to have that delegated to some part or automated part of the game without losing the ability to see the student's ability to make decisions, right? Since you're not targeting logistics. As we think about the length of a game, I think there are some key considerations you'd need to take into account, including student preparation, right? Student familiarity with the topic, content, and skills that you're looking for, and the level of knowledge or skill that you're trying to achieve at the end of the game. If you're looking for recall, that's going to be a very different amount of time invested than the ability to actively use and apply. And so I wish that there was a clear mathematical formula for that, but right now there haven't been enough studies that actually look at the variation in time that we spend in a particular type of game using the same or a common framework for design that would let us have some confidence there.
Okay, all right. Well, I have a question here. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here because this one kind of actually follows on quite well from what you just said there about briefing the students a little bit ahead of time, perhaps to kind of give them some insights. And so there's a question here about, to what extent do pre-briefings inform an understanding of existing dynamics among participants do the game designers, so do game designers use other means rather than pre-briefings to achieve this understanding? And can you give an example where such an insight has shaped game rules accordingly? So I guess the question here is what the effects the pre-briefings might have on those learning outcomes.
Yeah, so in some cases, if you're looking for application of knowledge, if you're looking for a particular skill and there's a requirement for students to have a certain level of knowledge, for example, in order to be able to participate in this activity. And here's an example, might be the Marine Corps planning process. If they don't understand or know the Marine Corps planning process, they're not going to be able to engage in a planning activity or exercise effectively or as effectively as those who have that baseline knowledge that's necessary to play the game and show their level of skill. So you would want to have some sort of preparation where they were taught that process and or taught the game rules, whether it's, how do they enter their data? How do they, document? How can they move their different pieces if it's a tabletop game? So that when you're observing their behavior during game time, you're not having their particular level of skill obscured by other factors. So yes, there is a line there in terms of preparing them to play the game and then like over preparing them, but most games don't have a right answer. So preparing them by letting them read the scenario, consider the scenario. What you want to consider, what you want to know is that they have an equal opportunity, an equal starting point for each of those students as they enter into the gameplay.
Okay, that's very interesting. And I'm kind of jumping down to question myself here, but just that idea of equal opportunity, is that a necessary thing for an analytic or educational game? Couldn't part of it be the point that it's slightly imbalanced? Do you think that could be detrimental?
So if you are looking to assess individuals and compare them, right, to say that this student has greater capability than that student, it wouldn't be fair to compare a student who didn't have the same opportunity to demonstrate that outcome, if that makes sense. So as a good example, in some of our planning exercises, we have leaders, right, who have a great opportunity. These are student leaders for planning teams, for example, and they make the final decisions. And they have a great opportunity to show leadership capabilities, whereas those who may have smaller roles or roles that they're not as familiar with don't have the same number or even sometimes the opportunity to demonstrate that learning outcome to the same level. So you want, if you're doing individual assessment, for there to be an equal opportunity because you're comparing those performances, and so the performances need to be comparable. But if you're going to do an assessment at a group level, and you're looking more at the group function within that system, then that's not as important.
That's very interesting. Another question here. From an assessment perspective, what is your understanding of the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of strategic pauses within games in support of teaching and learning?
Yeah, so I haven't seen any studies on that in a wargaming context. That would be interesting. When you read about the emergence of what they call stealth assessment, which is a shoot and wane idea. I'm going to write that down so that I put that on my reference list. So this idea of stealth assessment came about in assessment practice more broadly because of disruptions of assessment to the natural learning process. Because games are very experiential and there is an embeddedness of the student in the experience, and that's part of the learning overall. Something that disrupts or creates too much disjointedness in that experience can break the authenticity of that process itself. And it can also create a focus on evaluation as opposed to learning. And so they see that in the classroom. Stealth assessment originally came out looking at disruption in the classroom of assessment and how you could embed assessment opportunities in order to avoid like anxiety and like performance anxiety. But see skills in a real context without having that anxiety of being observed. Or always feeling that you're being observed. So what I would say is strategic pauses can be an opportunity to highlight key learning points, to talk about a particular formative opportunity, right? Like if there's that would disrupt the game, but then you're also shaping the game going forward, depending on what that opportunity is for. You can build in strategic pauses at some key points. For example, when faculty members brief back the results of a turn, you can avoid disrupting the natural sequence or narrative of events, because that's a moment when the faculty member has a responsibility for providing insights and telling the story of what just happened to that team. And so in combination, I would suggest that there are some opportunities to look for embedding and expanding the faculty member's role at those points, as opposed to disrupting the game. But I don't think there's one right answer to that question.
No, it's very interesting about breaking the flow, and hopefully I'll have time for a question about that as well. Related to that, there's a question here about, or just rather, somebody's asking your thoughts on assessing how participants prioritize and allocate time to collect information to inform their decisions in games where there's incomplete and asymmetric information. So do you have any thoughts on that information gathering process in games and how that operates in the learning process?
Yeah, I know there was a really interesting study. I wonder if they've written it up at I think they did over at Army War College. I know they presented it at one of their conferences, where they had looked at how students responded when presented with a problem. They were looking at problem-based learning, and they noticed that students accepted, some of their students accepted the problem at face value and didn't go about finding more information and competing perspectives. In some cases, I think it's a challenge to capture that information without creating some sort of an expansion of documentation for, so you can't, for example, have log files per se if they're doing external research, but you could look, if you had a set of documents that were available even in any of your learning management systems, at which documents the students decided to read that were provided to them, how long they spent on them, and others. So which advice did they choose to take first? What combination of advice did they go to in the time constraints that were available to them? And so that would be one way to embed, basically looking at kind of those log files, right? Like, did they read this? Number one, like sort of a 0 and a 1, which did they read, how long did they spend, and then which ones were reflected accurately in the options they came up with. And that would also tell you, hey, some of our students didn't go at all to the Department of X files, right? Like they went straight to their own department's files and stayed right there in the safe zone, right? Or they only spent X amount of time looking in this area, and why might that have been the case? So I think there are some opportunities there if you had a finite set of information they were working from, or that you wanted to track how they were working with it. You could also have some requirement that you built into some of their submissions in the process where they could tell you what information they pulled from as part of that, assess their problem framing and research separately from the actual decision itself. And often we go straight to the decision, and that's the convergent thinking, right? Not the research part of it, because it could still be the in the box and valuable, good. I'm going to say good. I hate to do that because I'm an assessment person, right? It could still be a good answer, right? It could be an acceptable answer that we would have gone for, but that doesn't tell us that it had the right reasoning and information behind it unless we look at it separately.
That could also be a very interesting mechanism just for detecting in a game in general players are being motivated by their briefing materials or by their own, views on what they think the issue is inside the game, right? You could see if they've been looking at these documents
Yeah.
at all before they started playing, or which ones. Another question here, I'm just for the people who are observing, I'm conscious that I'm not asking all the questions in the direct order, but I'm trying to ask them in a way that they sort of build from each other. So building from this as well in the discussion of students, acknowledging participation in war games can be performative. Do you feel involving the students in debriefing, like you suggest, can help account for a possible gap between more intuitive decision-making and action, and the performative kind in assessment or group collaboration settings? Or are there other ways this challenge can be mitigated?
Yeah, I think that involving students in the after action is a strong way to promote formative learning, because it requires them to make explicit those things that were implicit during the game. And it allows the faculty and the students who all experienced the same thing to analyze common experience and think about alternate pathways. One of the faculty members I interviewed said something to the effect of, in a seminar, you're able to tell them how you would have responded, right? But when you're in a game, you all experience the same cause and effect, right? So that you see it, and seeing can sometimes be believing. So it's not just the faculty member trying to illustrate that point, it's also the game, and then the group interpreting and talking about that data. So I think there's a lot of really great formative value, and these are not mutually exclusive, right? You can have great learning that's occurring in a game as well as an assessment that's occurring at the same time that's more summative, especially because in our professional responsibility is to prepare people for the future. So in some ways that is always formative. Did that fully answer the question?
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent, well, very, very good. Another question here now, so we're going to kind of step away a little bit from what's going on inside the games, and these are slightly more broader questions. One question here, you spoke about games as a way to test hypotheses. Have you also looked at assessment models for analytic war games as a method to develop hypotheses? And the questioner here, Madeline Johnson, is saying she's thinking about games that look at what if scenarios.
Oh.
So can this go the other way? Can this be used as a research tool, even though it's educational?
I think that it can, yes. There are some different, because what we're looking at really is a sequence of events, and the task model is the same, right? Your sequence of events will be the same. The types of data, if we think about it from those three buckets, will be the same. And having the strength of the argument and the standards that you want to take into account would also be the same. What would be different would be as you go back to that embeddedness. Oh, I'm going the wrong way into my cheat slides. If you think about your embeddedness here, would be the relationships between these different levels, right? So if you're looking at a thing, the object, they're going to be impacted by things that are by the group and the group's preparedness to deal with this scenario, as well as some of those key game design aspects. So if you're going to go at this from a research or evaluation measurement perspective, you would want to consider those interactions in particular across the nesting to make sure that you had the right individuals, so that it wasn't about individual capability, it was really about the what if scenario. So it's really about the potential outcomes. And in some cases, your structure of your game would want to be very different. So your design would be less towards free thinking in some cases, because you would want certain options to be narrowed in order to support your confidence in your conclusion. So what I mean by that is you might not want outside information to come into that perspective. And so you would be explicit in your assumptions about what information is available and that information is true in order to make a claim that that is something for the future.
Okay, very useful. I think I have a question here myself, which I'd like to ask, and I think that we still have time for one last one to kind of sum it all up. But the one I had here was to do with you discussed the concept of authentic learning, and game design and academic literature put a great deal of emphasis on the importance of immersion to get players to buy into the game experience and play with focus and sincerity. So I wonder, can you maybe expand a little bit more on how you think, firstly, do you think this immersion matters? I get the impression you do from the way you talk about authentic learning, but also why, and also whether or not it can sometimes actually distort learning in a game.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to start with the end of it. When can it distort learning? I think there is a strong possibility for negative learning in games that faculty need to be on the lookout for. And what I mean by that is, in some cases, games have had to oversimplify or fix rules, like fix by meaning like determine what those are, what an outcome will be. And so it can lead to false conclusions about reality. And there's some research on games-based learning that suggests that there's a challenge that players have recognizing, like in terms of how they challenge the rules of the alternate reality, right? That they accept them as truth. And so in that case, the lessons that they learn in that game there needs to be a purposeful attempt from the faculty member side to highlight where those things are disconnected. Right? Is this assumption true that the game has incorporated here? Because we don't want to over accept those rules and transfer them to a reality where they have been untested, right? And we don't, as designers, often have a rule book that tells people the explicit assumptions that we made about reality. In those games, but that would be a great learning opportunity, right? Because the students test their assumptions against the assumptions of the game. And so as we start with the negative learning, let's go back to the importance of immersion. There's some literature out there that looks at the importance of immersion with engagement. As we think about creativity, there's a great resource, and I'll write it down. Very hard to pronounce name, Csikszentmihalyi talks, right? And I hope I said that correctly. Great respect for this idea of flow, right? And flow is the sense of immersion that you can get into when you're going to produce something creative. And there's a lot of research then that Keith Sawyer has also done in terms of flow when we're talking about artistic context, but we don't talk about it a lot in the context of professional flow, right? But I think that plus repetition connects really beautifully with expert performance theory. And expert performance theory asserts that performance or excellence, expertise is really about repeatable high-level performance. Right. And so it's not that you have one moment of Zen where you achieve excellent performance. It's the ability that you are able to perform consistently well across time, and that you develop that through deliberate practice of the component parts and the actual altogether parts. And so they develop that within musical theory. And the idea is like you wouldn't, as a musician, ever stop playing scales, because scales are a major subcomponent of being able to play music. But you also would not stop practicing with your ensemble because that practice leads you to the more complex interactions that occur in that system, which lead you to be able to perform well consistently in a performance environment.
Yeah, okay, excellent. Well, we have two last questions. I know we're very short on time, but I think both of them should be answerable, I hope. One here, which is how much of a role do student evaluations play in faculty responsiveness to these kinds of curriculum and modifications? So for people who want to be moving towards using gaming, how much do you think that this is a student-driven process or can be a student-driven process? And then I'll have one last question after that to finish it out.
Yeah, and I can talk a little bit about what our student feedback has been. I'll say that we've done a quality enhancement plan that was focused on enhancing student creative problem solving over the last 5 years. And as part of that data collection, student feedback consistently was that group activities and games, war games exercises, were consistently one of the highest rated activities in terms of their ability to develop that skill and put it into play. I think, that was something that we were aware of, and that their feedback on which of those activities and the design of those activities like promoted creativity influenced the curriculum review process at the school level. I think there's certainly higher level guidance that's driving the incorporation of games in the curriculum that I had some pictures of in the beginning, based on a professional understanding of the value that these games can have, and that professional experience and wherewithal. What we struggle with, and will continue to refine that process over the next few years as we implement a rapid expansion of war games or gaming in the curriculum more deliberately, will be what outcomes are most appropriate to reinforce with war games? How can we combine different pedagogical approaches to make war games more effective? So that lecture game question, like what if having both is actually the sweet spot? And it depends on likely on content and prior familiarity and engagement. So students play a role in providing feedback on the curriculum. They have after actions in our setting on each of those games also, not an after action in terms of the learning debrief, but in terms of the game itself. I just think that there's a lot to think through in terms of a broader framework for what games when aligned with which learning outcomes and to what end. And again, going back to that question about and how long, right? Should we be dedicating time to games? Is it worth that cost in the curriculum for the gain that we get?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the trade-off with games. I know when I used to run a particular game when I was in American university, I used to always do on the week in which they were doing research for a big paper. So it's kind of like, okay, you're already doing a lot of, we don't have reading that week, so we'll play a game while we're doing that. But it's tricky to fit it into the syllabus. One last question here from Brian Bennett, which kind of gets to how we get this to a wider audience. So I'm going to throw a writer onto it. He asks, how do we get beyond the quote passionate gamer, wargamer, who can lead this kind of process to a self-sustaining activity which will survive and thrive? And I'm going to throw it the same question rephrased as, how do we get people who do not have experience with wargaming but are curious about using wargaming in the classroom and also in research? How can we bring them in?
Yeah, I think that is a huge challenge. It's especially as we push this activity out as something that we want to do more and more across military education, right? There's this demand without necessarily the opportunity for experimentation and growth. And there's also important from my perspective is also the sense of faculty ownership of the curriculum and their teaching. And in some cases, faculty may be less comfortable with those approaches because they have it's a different approach, and it requires experimentation and a lack of control that's not typical of certain other approaches, or that may seem like there are unwritten rules relative to that. I think that playing games is a path to teaching games. So creating opportunities for faculty to play games and evaluate them as learning opportunities is really important, because that recreates that type of ownership. And I have yet to meet a faculty member who didn't care deeply about the learning of their students. And so if they see opportunities to reinforce learning, they will do so. How to use it can also be something that we provide more resources on that are accessible and digestible, right? Like we deal well with checklists, but there aren't a lot of checklists for, hey, here's how to do this. Here are your scorecards. In some cases, we have at our university, we've set up a director of wargaming. So there's an idea that certain games can get facilitated, so the faculty can focus more on the learning and less on learning the game while they're actually trying to look at student learning. So there isn't that push for simultaneous learning in terms of the faculty member and students seeing the game for the first time together. There's a great initiative that was in the K-12 range where they were looking at, I think it was the Wilson Center. I have to remember the name, it'll come to me. But they had game workshops, and it was kind of like a gaming support network. And so people who wanted to learn gaming in the classroom could come to this in-person activity where they would learn how to create and design games. And it was more like gamification than a full game, right? Can you have some gamification in your classroom? And they would actually, through that week-long process, create a game that they would bring back. I could see us able to amend that process at a wargaming level. Then those people went back and committed to using it in the classroom several times, and to also doing a train the trainer activity with their peers. But they had a support network with those folks who were also in the same cohort and their mentor who taught them the game design. And then I believe they published their experiences at the end or in some capacity to try and raise awareness about what they learned as part of that process. And I think establishing that kind of dialogue and opportunity for experimentation could be valuable.
Oh, very interesting. Okay, I think that's it. We're already gone over 5 minutes, but that shows, I think, how much interest there was in this. I just want to take the time to say thank you so much, Kuehn, for a really, really, really interesting presentation. I thought that was just so in-depth and so sort of substantive. So I really appreciate it. And it's really set the tone for this year's series. So many thanks to you. Many thanks to all the people who've come, who put in questions, and who participated and observed. And we do invite you to join us for our next speaker series, which will be next month, and the details will be forthcoming. But thank you again to Kate, and we'll see you all again soon.